Story 1. The Passenger. The night weighed heavily on the lone stretch of highway, far from any signs of civilization. Bob Big Rig Mitchell, a seasoned trucker with a reputation for fearlessness, pushed his 18-wheeler forward through the obsidian void. His truck's engine roared, a familiar lullaby that usually accompanied him on these desolate roads. Bob had faced his share of eerie stories and supernatural legends throughout his years on the road. He scoffed at ghost stories and dismissed urban legends as truck stop chatter, but that night would change everything. As his truck rumbled down the empty road, Bob's keen eyes spotted something in the distance, just at the edge of his headlight's reach. At first he thought it was just a trick of the night, but the image became more defined as he drew nearer. A woman, standing alone on the road, her long dark hair obscuring her face. Bob's heart quickened, and he eased off the gas, slowing his rig as he approached the mysterious figure. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving, but a deep-rooted sense of responsibility for fellow travelers urged him to check if she needed help. He rolled down his window and called out, "Hey, are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her hair concealing her features like a curtain of shadows. Bob's unease grew, but he couldn't bring himself to drive past her without at least making sure she was okay. He put his truck in park and climbed out, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Ma'am, do you need any assistance?" he asked again, his voice wavering. The woman slowly lifted her head, revealing piercing, somewhat luminescent eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Her face was pale and gaunt, her lips cracked and dry. She stared at Bob with an intensity that made his hair stand on end. "I need a ride," she whispered, her voice hollow and haunting. Bob hesitated for a moment, his rational mind screaming at him to get back in the truck and drive away. But against his better judgment, he opened the passenger door and motioned for her to climb in. The woman seemed to almost levitate into the cab, her cold presence sending a chill through the confined space. Bob's heart pounded as he slid back into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye, trying to make sense of the unsettling situation. "Where are you headed?" Bob finally asked, breaking the eerie silence that had settled in the cab. "Home," the woman replied, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. Bob's anxiety intensified. He knew there was no town or house for miles around, just the desolate road stretching into the unknown. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As they continued down the dark highway, the woman's presence seemed to cast a malevolent shadow over the truck. Bob's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had changed his mind and wanted to send her out, to leave her on the side of the road, but fear kept him silent. Suddenly, the woman spoke again, her voice chillingly clear this time. "You shouldn't have stopped for me, Bob." Bob's heart stopped. How did she know his name? He stole a glance at her and her eyes met his, glowing with an unsettling knowingness. "Who are you?" Bob demanded, his voice trembling. She leaned closer, her face inches from his. "I'm the reason you'll never stop for another person ever again." Before Bob could react, her form began to change, shifting and warping until she was nothing but an amorphous, shadowy mass. Terror coursed through him as he realized he had picked up something inhuman, something that defied all reason. The truck swerved wildly as Bob struggled to maintain control. He could hear her sinister laughter echoing in his mind as the world around him twisted and distorted. The truck seemed to take on a life of its own and careened off the road and into the darkness, its headlights fading into oblivion. The next morning, a passing trucker discovered the wreckage. The cab was empty, and there was no sign of Bob Mitchell. The police launched an investigation, and initially had little answers. 2 days later, Bob was found miles away from the wreckage, disoriented and disheveled. When the authorities located him, he was sitting by the side of the road, staring blankly into the distance. When he finally came to his senses, Bob recounted the story of the woman, her haunting presence, and the malevolent force that had seemed to possess his truck. But when asked about the 2 days following the crash, his memory was an impenetrable void. He couldn't recall how he had ended up miles away from the wreckage, or what had transpired during that time. In the years that followed, Bob's story became a legend among truckers and travelers. The highway, a lifeline for those who traversed it, now took on an air of mystery and uncertainty. Bob himself grappled with the events of that night. No one could provide answers to the lingering questions. Why had he been found so far from the wreckage, and what had transpired during the days that had slipped through his consciousness like grains of sand through an hourglass? The answers, it seems, will forever lie with the passenger, in the unknown. Story 2. Driving Through a Portal to Hell. I'd driven that route countless times, a long, desolate stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. It was a late-night haul, like so many before it, and the monotonous drone of the engine blended with the crackling radio in the background. It was a familiar routine, one I could perform in my sleep. But this night would prove to be anything but routine. I was hauling a load of goods from one end of the state to the other, a journey I had made countless times. The hours had blurred together, and exhaustion was settling in. My eyelids grew heavy, and I fought to stay awake, knowing I still had miles to cover before I could rest. The road stretched out before me, a never-ending ribbon of asphalt that disappeared into the inky blackness of the night. Then it happened. A brilliant, blinding light appeared right in the middle of the road. It was as if the night itself had split open, revealing a searing, white-hot core. Panic surged through me as I realized I didn't have time to react. I was driving straight into it. The moment I passed through the light, reality seemed to shatter. My vision blurred, and the truck vibrated with a violent energy. It was a sensation beyond words, an overwhelming disorientation that left me gasping for breath. When the light dissipated, I found myself in a world that bore no resemblance to the one I knew. The road beneath me was cracked and pitted, the surroundings barren and eerie. What had been a familiar highway now resembled a nightmarish wasteland. My heart hammered in my chest as I continued to drive, my hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. There was no turning back, no escape from this terrifying new reality. The road stretched out endlessly before me, a lonely path into the unknown. Just as I began to believe that my drive couldn't become any more terrifying, I began to see them, figures that lined the side of the road and seemed to defy the very laws of nature. They stood there, like grotesque sentinels of a world gone awry, frozen in eerie, unnatural poses, their limbs contorted at unnatural angles, like marionettes held by invisible strings. Ragged, tattered garments clung to their emaciated bodies, fluttering in the unnatural wind that carved through this desolate place. Their skin, if it could even be called that, was a sickly shade of gray. Though their faces remained shrouded in darkness, their eyes burned with malevolence, each one a swirling vortex of dread and despair. I couldn't tear my gaze away from those eyes, even as terror clawed at my throat. Silent and unblinking, they watched my every move, their gaze following my truck as it continued down the nightmarish highway. Their presence was suffocating, an oppressive weight that pressed down on me, filling me with a bone-chilling dread that refused to let go. I could feel their gaze burrowing into my soul, probing my innermost fears and insecurities. It was as though they could see every secret, every hidden weakness, and they reveled in the terror they provoked. My hands clenched the steering wheel even tighter as I fought to maintain control. Fear gripped me as I tried to make sense of the situation, to find some logical explanation for the inexplicable. But there was none to be found in this nightmarish hell. I was trapped, a prisoner of this horrifying world, with no idea of how or why I had ended up here, or how I would get out. Just when I was on the brink of total despair, I saw it, another blinding light in the middle of the road. As before, I didn't have time to react, to even think, as I drove straight through it. The light enveloped me once more, and for a moment I was weightless, adrift in a sea of brilliance. When the light faded, I found myself back on the familiar highway, the one I had driven countless times before. The figures were gone, and normalcy began to settle in. But still, something was different. I glanced at the road signs, not expecting to see what I saw next. It was the name of a nearby town, a place that should have been hundreds of miles away from where I had been just moments before. I pulled into a diner, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I needed to make sense of what had just happened, to find some explanation for the inexplicable. The waitress behind the counter gave me a curious look as she poured me a cup of coffee. As I sat in the dimly lit diner, staring out at the world beyond the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had glimpsed a parallel world, a nightmarish mirror image of our own. Had it all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and the long hours on the road? If so, how could I have ended up in this small town hundreds of miles away from where I should have been? One thing was certain: I would never dare venture onto that stretch of highway ever again. Thanks for tuning into another episode from the Alley of Nightmares. If you enjoyed the video, please like it, subscribe, and share with all your friends. Until next time,